The air in the abandoned lab was thick with dust and the sharp tang of chemicals. Dorian Hale crouched over his workstation, carefully measuring the final component of his latest formula. The serum, a deep amber liquid, shimmered under the dim emergency lighting. He had spent months scavenging rare compounds, refining every detail to ensure it enhanced cognitive and physical functions without side effects. Unlike last time. He clenched his jaw, shaking off the memory of his ruined research facility, the colleagues who had trusted him, the disaster that had made him a fugitive. A faint noise, barely a whisper against the silence, made him freeze. His fingers instinctively tapped a pattern on the metal table, calculating. It was the fourth sound in under a minute, not the usual groan of settling debris. Someone was here. Reaching for his sidearm, Dorian moved carefully, following the sound toward the storage bay. His heart pounded, though his breath remained steady. The last thing he needed was some scavenger ruining months of work. He eased around the corner, catching sight of a figure rummaging through a crate of supplies. Not human. The stranger was tall, her skin reflecting the low light with an iridescent sheen. Long, almost weightless strands of hair shifted from pearlescent white to pale violet as she moved. She was fast, her hands darting through vials and containers with precision. But there was something off. Her motions weren't calculated like a practiced thief's. They were frantic. Dorian stepped forward, weapon raised. You picked the wrong place to loot. The figure whirled, golden eyes locking onto him. No, not golden. Violet but shifting, the pupils contracting into slits as she assessed him. He barely had time to process the detail before she bolted. Dorian lunged, but she was already moving, vaulting onto a rusted support beam, scaling it with inhuman speed. His mind worked rapidly, analyzing her movement, enhanced agility, heightened reflexes. That meant she wasn't just any alien. You don't need to run, he called out. I just want my supplies back. She hesitated, balancing on the edge of a high storage shelf. Then her eyes flicked downward and she made a split-second decision. She dropped, straight toward the table. Dorian swore, rushing forward, but he was too late. The impact sent a ripple through the cluttered lab. Glass shattered. The vials of serum, meticulously stored, tumbled. The largest one, the most concentrated, was caught mid-fall, by her. Before he could yell, she uncorked it with her teeth and downed the entire dose. Dorian's stomach dropped. What the hell did you just do? She staggered back, the vial slipping from her fingers. She caught herself against the table, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Then her body trembled. A visible shiver ran down her arms, her glowing skin pulsing brighter. Dorian knew what came next. Sit down, he ordered, moving toward her. She didn't respond. Her expression flickered between confusion and something else. Something darker. Her fingers clenched against the table as if steadying herself. Her eyes locked onto him, pupils dilating unnaturally. She swayed and he caught her before she collapsed. What's happening? She whispered, her voice laced with something almost desperate. Dorian gritted his teeth, lowering her onto a clear space. You drank something that wasn't meant for you. She exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly. It feels strange. No shit. He ignored the frustration burning through him and grabbed a scanner, running it over her. The data flickered in front of him, heart rate elevated, neural activity surging, muscle response spiking beyond normal parameters. Then her hand caught his wrist. The contact was startlingly firm, her fingers cool against his skin. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent an unexpected pulse through him. I need more. Dorian pulled back. Absolutely not. She inhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. He wasn't sure if it was pain or something else. He didn't have time to figure it out. The distant hum of an approaching vessel sent adrenaline surging through him. They weren't alone. Dorian's mind snapped back into focus. The distant hum of approaching thrusters wasn't just background noise, it was trouble. He moved swiftly to the control panel. fingers flying over the worn-out interface to access external sensors. A ship, sleek and black, hovered just beyond the ruined building's perimeter. The smugglers had arrived. He turned back to the alien woman who was still gripping the edge of the table, her breath shallow but steadying. The initial tremors from the serum's effects had subsided, but something about the way she held herself, rigid, coiled, ready to spring, told him she wasn't entirely in control. Dorian didn't have time for this. "You need to move," he ordered, slinging his pack over his shoulder and grabbing a compact pulse rifle from the shelf. "Unless you want to find out what happens when a bunch of smugglers get their hands on something they don't understand." She blinked at him as if trying to process his words through the haze of whatever the serum was doing to her. Then her head tilted, her nostrils flaring slightly. "They're armed," she murmured, her voice low and smooth. "7 of them. Heavy ordnance. Their leader is nervous." Dorian froze. "How do you know that?" She glanced at him, a flicker of realization crossing her face. Her pupils dilated again and her skin pulsed faintly. Dorian clenched his jaw. The serum wasn't just amplifying her physical abilities, it was sharpening her senses beyond normal levels. He should have expected this. It was designed to enhance reaction time and perception in humans, but she wasn't human. "I can smell their sweat," she continued, her lips pressing together, "and their weapons, plasma-based, unstable power cells." Dorian didn't know whether to be impressed or worried, probably both, but there was no time to dwell on it. He grabbed her wrist. "We're leaving, now." She yanked back, surprisingly strong. "I'm not going with you," Dorian exhaled sharply. "Fine. Then stay here and see how long it takes them to dissect you." Her gaze flickered toward the door, as if assessing the likelihood of a fight. He could see the calculations in her expression. And then, finally, she nodded. Dorian didn't waste another second. He led the way through the back of the ruined facility, navigating the maze of collapsed corridors. The structural integrity of the place was shot, debris blocking several possible exits. Behind him, he could hear her breathing, controlled, measured, but slightly unsteady. The serum's effects weren't wearing off. If anything, they were settling deeper into her system. Dorian glanced over his shoulder. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Xyra." No last name, or maybe she didn't have one. "Dorian," he offered. "Try to keep up." They reached a service tunnel and Dorian worked quickly to override the security panel. His fingers danced across the cracked screen, bypassing ancient protocols, rerouting power to a long-dead access door. The seconds stretched. The smugglers would breach the facility any moment now. Then Xyra stiffened. "They've entered." Dorian didn't ask how she knew. He slammed his palm against the console. The door whirred, then groaned as it started to slide open, a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. "Go," he urged. Xyra slipped through first, her movements unnervingly fluid. He followed right after, forcing the panel to shut behind them. They emerged into the underbelly of the structure, a maintenance tunnel leading out into the ruins. Xyra was already scanning their surroundings. "Which way?" Dorian pointed west. "I have a ship stashed about 3 clicks that way." She looked skeptical. "You don't seem like someone who works well with others. Why do you have a ship here?" "Because I plan ahead," he muttered, moving quickly. They darted through the rubble, keeping low, but Dorian knew it wouldn't take long for the smugglers to figure out where they had gone. He could already hear movement behind them, distant but closing. Xyra suddenly stopped. Her head turned slightly, and her entire posture shifted. Dorian barely had time to react before she shoved him behind a collapsed wall, pressing her body flush against his to keep him hidden. The smugglers passed barely a few feet away. Dorian's pulse pounded, not just from the proximity of danger but from the warmth of Xyra's body against his. Her breath was steady, controlled. He wasn't sure if she was even blinking. The smugglers hesitated, scanning the ruins. One of them spoke, his voice rough. "Scanner picked up movement. They're close." Dorian could feel the tension in Xyra's muscles, every fiber of her being screamed readiness, as if she could launch into action at any second. Then, in a whisper so quiet it was almost inaudible, she murmured, "Stay still." Dorian didn't argue. The smugglers lingered a moment longer, then one of them cursed. "Forget it. They're already moving toward the west. Let's cut them off." Their footsteps faded. Xyra waited several more seconds before she finally exhaled and stepped back. Dorian let out a slow breath. "You're full of surprises." She met his gaze. "You have no idea." Then she turned, leading the way into the ruins as if she had always known the path. Dorian didn't waste time questioning how Xyra moved like she knew the terrain by heart. They had bigger problems. The smugglers were repositioning, and if they didn't make it to his ship soon, they'd be boxed in. He adjusted his pack, pulse rifle secured at his side, and followed her through the crumbling remnants of the facility's outskirts. The terrain outside was rough, twisted metal, collapsed structures, and gaping chasms where the ground had given way to underground tunnels. The planet had been abandoned for a reason. Every step kicked up a fine layer of dust and the lingering scent of scorched metal. Dorian had navigated this route before, but never with someone at his side. Xyra moved with an effortless grace, her steps nearly silent. Whatever the serum had done to her, it wasn't just a temporary enhancement. She was adapting, integrating the changes as if they had always been a part of her. Dorian watched as she suddenly halted, tilting her head slightly. "What now?" he muttered. She inhaled deeply, her violet eyes narrowing. "They're trying to cut us off ahead." Dorian wasn't sure if he should be impressed or worried. She wasn't guessing, she knew. "That serum's really doing a number on you," he said, keeping his voice low. Xyra turned to face him fully. "You're responsible for this." Dorian tensed. "Yeah, and I'm also the only one trying to fix it." Her gaze flickered downward, her hands curling into fists, then relaxing. It was subtle, but he caught it, the struggle to maintain control. The serum was pulling at her instincts, her body adjusting faster than her mind could process. "We can argue about blame later," he said. "Right now, we need to change course before we walk straight into their trap." Xyra exhaled through her nose, nodding once. "This way." She veered sharply to the right, leading them into a collapsed industrial sector. The jagged remains of storage tanks and cargo haulers littered the area. The metal structures creaked in the wind, rust flaking from their surfaces. Dorian stayed close, scanning the wreckage for any signs of movement. He didn't trust that they had truly evaded the smugglers. Xyra's pace slowed as they reached a large, overturned freighter that had been hollowed out by time and decay. She crouched near an opening in the hull, motioning for Dorian to do the same. He hesitated, then knelt beside her. She turned to him, her voice low. "They know about your ship." Dorian's stomach twisted. "Of course they do. They'll have men waiting." Dorian ran a hand through his hair, jaw tightening. This was spiraling out of control fast. "We can't stay here. There's no cover once we get past this sector." Xyra studied him for a moment before speaking. "We don't need cover, we need misdirection." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "You have a plan." She pressed a hand to her temple briefly, as if steadying herself. "Something like that." Before he could press for details, she was already moving again, faster this time. He swore under his breath but followed. The air grew heavier as they approached the edge of the wreckage. Dorian could see the distant outline of his ship, barely visible behind a ridge of scorched rock. Just beyond it, two figures stood guard, their weapons at the ready. Xyra crouched beside him, her breath steady. "Can you fly it remotely?" Dorian shook his head. "Not from here. The signal would be intercepted." She exhaled slowly. "Then we take them out." Dorian frowned. "By we you mean, I'll handle the guards," she interrupted. "You get to the ship." Dorian studied her, trying to gauge whether she was thinking clearly or if the serum was influencing her decision-making. He didn't like it. "I can take one," he countered. Her lips curved slightly, almost amused. "You're slow." Dorian huffed. And you're reckless." Something flickered in her expression, something unreadable. Then she reached out, her fingers lightly grazing his forearm. The touch was brief but electric, sending a strange heat through him. "You have your skills, I have mine," she murmured. "Trust me." Dorian wasn't sure if it was the serum talking or if this was who she really was. Either way, he didn't have time to argue. "Fine," he muttered, "but if this goes sideways, it won't." She was gone before he could finish. Dorian watched as she moved, silent as a shadow, disappearing into the ruins. He stayed low, waiting, his pulse hammering in his ears. Seconds stretched, then motion. One of the guards shifted, confusion flickering across his stance. Dorian saw the way his posture changed, the way he instinctively turned toward something unseen. Then he was down. No sound, no warning. Dorian had barely processed it when the second guard tensed, reaching for his communicator. Xyra moved like lightning, a blur of iridescent motion. A brief, choked gasp. The second guard crumpled. Dorian let out a slow breath, then bolted toward the ship. Xyra was already at the ramp, her expression unreadable. "Move," she urged. Dorian didn't need to be told twice. He powered up the ship's systems, fingers flying over the controls. The engines roared to life, thrusters engaging. Then a warning flashed across his screen. "Inbound heat signatures." "They have a ship," Dorian growled. Xyra's jaw tightened. "Then we outrun them." Dorian wasn't so sure about that. He gripped the controls as the ship lifted off, the planet shrinking beneath them. Xyra stood behind him, her hand braced on the back of his seat, her breathing steady despite the chaos. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then she exhaled. "You should have let me take more." Dorian's grip on the controls tightened. "We don't even know what it's doing to you." Her gaze bore into him, intense and unreadable. "I know exactly what it's doing." Dorian swallowed hard. This wasn't over, not even close. Dorian pushed the ship's thrusters to their limit, breaking through the planet's atmosphere with a shuddering jolt. The smuggler vessel was already in pursuit, a predatory silhouette on his scanners, its weapons charging. Xyra stood just behind him, her fingers curled around the back of his seat, gaze locked on the display. The violet in her irises pulsed faintly, shifting like liquid amethyst. Whatever the serum had done to her, it wasn't just amplifying her body. It was enhancing her awareness, making her hyper-attuned to every threat. "They're going to fire," she said. Dorian didn't argue. He flicked a switch, activating the ship's countermeasures. The engines howled as he threw them into a sharp bank, barely dodging a pulse blast that streaked past them, illuminating the cockpit in a bright flare. "They're faster," Xyra murmured. Dorian gritted his teeth. "Not smarter." He pulled the controls hard to the right, skimming the edge of a dense asteroid cluster. The smugglers followed, but their ship was bulkier, less maneuverable. Dorian weaved between the jagged rock formations, pushing his ship through gaps that forced their pursuers to slow down. "They'll anticipate your pattern," Xyra warned. Dorian almost laughed. "You think I fly with a pattern?" She glanced at him, assessing. Then, for the first time, he saw it, that flicker of amusement, brief but unmistakable. He flipped the ship into a sudden spiral, skimming the surface of a massive asteroid before diving beneath it at the last second. The smuggler ship wasn't as lucky. A burst of rock and debris exploded behind them as the larger vessel clipped the edge, sending it into an uncontrolled spin. Dorian exhaled sharply. "That buys us time." Xyra straightened, her gaze still on the sensors. "Not enough." He glanced at her, catching the tension in her stance. She wasn't wrong. The smugglers weren't the type to give up after one failed chase. They'd regroup, track them again. Dorian pulled up a navigation map, plotting an escape route. "We need somewhere to refuel and lay low." Xyra was still watching him, something unreadable in her expression. Then finally she said, "I know a place." Dorian arched an eyebrow. "You, a runaway noble, have a place to hide." Her lips twitched slightly. You're not the only one who plans ahead." She reached over and entered coordinates manually. The location popped up on his display, a derelict space station on the fringes of mapped space, long abandoned. Dorian frowned. That place hasn't been operational in decades. Exactly, he hesitated. The station was a black zone, unmonitored, unpredictable. If something went wrong, there'd be no backup, no reinforcements. But that also meant no smugglers, no authorities, and no one to ask questions. Dorian sighed, locking in the course. This better not be a trap. Xyra's gaze flickered toward him. If it were, you wouldn't see it coming. Dorian shook his head, muttering under his breath. He didn't know if the serum had made her more reckless or if this was just who she had always been. The ship lurched into hyperspace, stars stretching into endless lines. Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken questions. Dorian leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "So, want to tell me what that serum is actually doing to you?" Xyra hesitated. He watched her carefully. The way she held herself, rigid, composed, told him more than words ever could. She was adjusting, but she didn't know how deep the changes ran. She met his gaze. "It's heightening everything. My senses, my instincts." A pause. "My impulses." Dorian caught the way her fingers twitched against the console, how her breath hitched ever so slightly. She wasn't just talking about her reflexes. His pulse kicked up, but he kept his voice even. "And that's why you wanted more." Xyra's jaw tightened. "I don't like being at the mercy of anything. If I have more, I can control it." Dorian studied her. He understood that fear, the need to master something before it mastered you. But this wasn't just any substance. It was something he had created, and he had no idea how far it could push her before she lost herself. "You think it's giving you control," he said quietly. "But what if it's the opposite?" Xyra held his gaze, unblinking. The air between them felt charged, tension coiling between words unsaid. Then she did something unexpected. She leaned in. Close enough that Dorian could see the faint shimmer of bioluminescence tracing the veins in her throat, the subtle shift of color in her eyes. Her voice dropped just above a whisper. "If I wanted to lose control, Dorian." Her fingers brushed lightly against his wrist. "You'd know." A slow heat crept up his spine, but he forced himself to stay still, to not react. She was testing him, or maybe testing herself. Dorian exhaled slowly. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, "without you overdosing on something we don't understand." She studied him for a long moment before leaning back, the intensity in her gaze never wavering. "You're stubborn," she said finally. Dorian smirked. "You're just figuring that out." A soft huff of amusement. Then silence. The ship continued hurtling through hyperspace, the distant hum of the engines the only sound between them. Whatever they were heading into, Dorian knew one thing. This wasn't just about the serum anymore. The space station loomed ahead, a silent giant in the abyss. Its exterior was scorched and pockmarked from decades of neglect, massive sections of plating missing, exposing skeletal framework. The place had been abandoned long before Dorian had even begun his research career. No official records, no active defenses, no life signs. Which meant no one to help them if things went south. Dorian slowed the ship's approach, scanning for a stable docking port. "You're sure about this place?" Xyra stood at his side, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the station. "It was a trade hub once. Smugglers, exiles, people with nowhere else to go. Then the air filtration failed. Everyone who stayed behind suffocated." Dorian gave her a sharp look. "Comforting." Xyra's lips barely twitched. "It means no one will be looking for us here." He didn't argue. It was sound logic. He aligned the ship with an old docking bay, overriding what remained of the station's archaic systems. The clamps locked into place with a groan of strained metal. A faint hiss signaled a seal, but the integrity warnings flashing on his display told him everything he needed to know. This place was one good explosion away from breaking apart. As soon as the airlock opened, Xyra stepped out first. Dorian followed, pulse rifle in hand. He wasn't about to take any chances. The air was thin but breathable, the station's weak atmosphere processors still clinging to life. A dim emergency glow illuminated the corridors, casting long, flickering shadows. Xyra moved ahead without hesitation. There's an old maintenance sector below. It should have enough shielding to block any scans. Dorian followed, stepping over broken debris and tangled wiring. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. The kind of silence that felt wrong. Dorian's grip tightened on his rifle. How'd you even know about this place? Xyra didn't answer immediately. She kept walking, her movements precise, controlled. Finally, she murmured, "I came here once, a long time ago." Dorian frowned. He'd expected something vague, but there was weight in her tone. He wanted to ask more, but something told him she wouldn't answer. Not yet. They reached a large chamber, an old cargo hold. Xyra stopped near a rusted-out terminal, placing her hand on its surface. Her skin pulsed faintly, an odd bioluminescent reaction he hadn't seen before. Dorian narrowed his eyes. "Is that the serum or just something your species does?" Xyra flexed her fingers, watching the glow fade. "I don't know." Dorian didn't like that answer. He set his pack down and pulled out a small scanner. "Let me check your vitals." Xyra exhaled sharply. "You're relentless. You drank an experimental compound not designed for your biology," he shot back. "Excuse me for wanting to make sure you're not about to melt from the inside." Xyra smirked faintly but held still as he ran the scanner over her. The results populated quickly: elevated neural activity, enhanced metabolic response, increased muscular density. Everything was trending upward. Too upward. Dorian frowned. "Your body isn't rejecting the serum anymore." Xyra tilted her head. "That's a good thing." "That depends," Dorian muttered. He tapped a few commands, running deeper scans. "Your DNA is shifting, not just adapting, changing. At this rate, I don't know what you'll be in a few days." Xyra studied him for a moment. Then she reached out and without hesitation grabbed his wrist. Her grip was firm but not forceful. "You think I'm afraid," she said quietly. Dorian held her gaze. "You should be." Xyra's fingers tightened, not in aggression but in something far more controlled, calculated. Then she pulled him closer, just slightly, just enough that the tension between them crackled like a live wire. "I'm not," she murmured. Dorian swallowed hard. His brain ran through a dozen possible responses, but none of them seemed to matter in that moment. She wasn't just talking about the serum. This was something else. A test, a challenge, a choice. His pulse jumped. Xyra's eyes flicked down, just for a fraction of a second before she released him and took a step back. Dorian exhaled slowly. "You enjoy making things difficult, don't you?" Her lips curved slightly. "It's entertaining." Dorian ran a hand through his hair, trying to refocus. "We need to figure out our next move before the smugglers track us." Xyra leaned against the terminal, watching him. "You have a plan." Dorian tapped his wrist console, pulling up ship diagnostics. "Your body's stabilizing, but that doesn't mean you won't hit a breaking point. I need to isolate what's triggering the changes before they accelerate beyond control." Xyra arched an eyebrow. "And if I don't want to stop them?" Dorian's jaw clenched. "Then you're an idiot." She laughed, soft and quiet. Dorian scowled. "This isn't funny. It's a little funny." He exhaled sharply, muttering a curse. "You don't even know what you're becoming." Xyra pushed off the console, stepping closer again. "Maybe something better." Dorian's throat tightened. She was too close. Her presence was tangible, like heat against his skin. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something woven into the unknown space between them. He should have been focused on the science, on the risk. Instead, all he could think about was the way her voice had dropped just slightly, the way her fingers had lingered on his wrist, the way she looked at him as if she already knew what he was afraid to say. Dorian forced himself to break the moment. "Get some rest. I'll work on the scans." Xyra held his gaze for a second longer before nodding. "Don't work too hard, scientist." She turned, heading toward the darker side of the chamber. Dorian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was in deep, and he knew it. Dorian worked through the night, if night even meant anything in the lightless ruins of the station. His console cast a dim glow across the cargo hold as he analyzed the data streaming from Xyra's scans. He tried to focus, but his mind kept pulling in two directions. One toward the science, the problem that needed solving, the other toward her. Xyra wasn't asleep. He could hear her breathing, steady and measured, from the far side of the chamber. Even in rest, she was alert. Maybe it was her species, maybe it was the serum, maybe she was just always like that. Dorian leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. His fingers tapped absently against the metal panel beside him, rhythm forming in the back of his mind. A habit, a grounding mechanism, and then, barely above a whisper, "You think too much." He turned. Xyra stood near one of the rusted-out cargo containers, arms loose at her sides, watching him with those shifting violet eyes. She had discarded her outer jacket, revealing the faint bioluminescent patterns that pulsed along her arms, her skin catching the dim light in a way that made her seem both alien and completely, undeniably real. Dorian arched an eyebrow. "You don't think enough." She smirked slightly, stepping closer. "That's not true. You drank something without knowing what it was." He gestured toward his console. "And now you're—" He stopped himself, searching for the right word. Xyra tilted her head. "Changing," Dorian exhaled. "Yes." She studied him for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, she closed the distance between them. Not fast, not sudden. Just a slow, deliberate step forward until she was close enough that he could see the faint movement of her breath. "Does it scare you?" she asked quietly. Dorian's pulse kicked up, not from fear, from something else. He forced himself to keep his voice steady. "What part? The fact that I don't know what's happening to you, or the fact that you don't seem to care?" Xyra's lips curved faintly, but there was something softer beneath it. "I do care." She reached out, her fingers trailing along the edge of the console beside him, not touching him, not yet. Dorian swallowed hard. "You're different than you were before the serum." Xyra nodded slightly. "I am. And you don't want to stop it." Another nod. "I don't." Dorian's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it'll do to you long term." She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do you." Dorian's breath caught. For a moment, the space between them didn't exist. The hum of the station faded. The world narrowed to the heat of her presence, the sharp intensity in her gaze, the way his own body betrayed him, leaning in despite everything his mind screamed against. Then her hand brushed his, just barely. A controlled touch, measured, testing. Dorian didn't pull away. Xyra tilted her head slightly. "Still afraid?" Dorian's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Not of you." Her pupils dilated just a fraction. Her hand pressed more firmly against his, and then, with absolute certainty, she whispered, "Good." The distance between them closed. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't hesitant. It was slow, deliberate, inevitable. Her lips met his with the weight of unspoken things, questions they hadn't asked, answers they weren't ready for, an understanding that had been simmering from the moment she had first looked at him with those impossible eyes. Dorian had spent years avoiding things like this. Too much risk, too much room for failure, too much chance of losing control. But with Xyra, control had never been an option, and he didn't care. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss with a quiet, unspoken demand. Dorian responded before he could think, before logic could catch up. His hands found her waist, the heat of her skin beneath his palms sending a pulse of something sharp and electric through his veins. The kiss broke, but she didn't pull away. Her forehead rested lightly against his, her breath warm against his lips. Her voice was quieter now. "You still want to fix me, don't you?" Dorian exhaled, his grip tightening slightly. "I don't know." Xyra's fingers trailed up, resting just over his pulse. "You do," Dorian swallowed. "Maybe I just don't want to lose you." Xyra's breath hitched, just slightly. And then, softer than before, she murmured, "Then don't." The words settled between them, heavy and final. Dorian closed his eyes briefly, then pressed another kiss to her temple. It was different this time. Less fire, more gravity. "I'll figure this out," he promised. Xyra nodded against him. "I know." And for the first time he believed her. The hum of the station's failing systems filled the silence between them. Dorian still held Xyra close, his pulse slowly settling, but the weight of reality pressed in on them. The moment had shifted, no longer raw urgency, no longer the charged pull of something inevitable. Now it was something heavier, something real. Xyra was still changing. Dorian felt it in the way she moved, the way her body responded before her mind even had to think. He could see it in the faint glow along her skin, in the heightened awareness behind her eyes. The serum had altered her, but it wasn't just an enhancement anymore. It was a transformation, and he still didn't know how far it would go. Xyra must have sensed his thoughts because she pulled back just slightly, searching his face. "You're overthinking again." Dorian huffed a quiet breath. "Can't help it." She studied him for a long moment. Then she exhaled, reaching for his wrist, lifting it between them. Her fingers traced over his pulse, slow and deliberate. "You want to stop this?" Dorian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his fingers shift, lacing through hers, holding her there. "I want to understand it." Xyra tilted her head slightly. "And if understanding means undoing?" Dorian's grip on her tightened. "Then I ask you if that's what you want." Something flickered in her expression, a crack in the certainty she always carried. "I don't know." Dorian's chest tightened at the honesty in her voice. For all the strength she had gained, for all the power the serum had unlocked, this wasn't easy for her either. He had been so focused on what it was doing to her body that he hadn't stopped to ask what it was doing to her mind. "Then we find out together," he murmured. Xyra held his gaze. She didn't move for a long moment, as if weighing something unspoken. Then she nodded. Dorian squeezed her hand once before releasing it. He turned back toward his console, refocusing on the data he had gathered from her scans. "I need to run a deeper analysis. If I can isolate the markers that are still shifting, I might be able to stabilize whatever's happening before it pushes you too far." Xyra leaned against the rusted console beside him, watching the screens flicker with unreadable code. "And if I don't want to be stabilized?" Dorian glanced at her. "Then tell me where the line is." Xyra didn't answer. Dorian exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. He wasn't going to push her, not when she was still figuring out what this meant for her. But the longer they waited, the greater the risk. And risk was something neither of them could afford. The station shuddered. Dorian snapped upright, instinct kicking in. That wasn't the usual groan of failing metal. That was external. Xyra's posture shifted immediately. "We're not alone," Dorian swore, flipping to the external sensors. The feed was weak, barely functioning, but the readings didn't lie. A ship had just entered orbit. His stomach sank. "The smugglers. They tracked us," he muttered. Xyra was already moving. "Then we need to leave." Dorian barely had time to grab his gear before she was at the door, her movements sharp and precise. He watched the way her body adjusted, the way she instinctively positioned herself between him and potential threats. The serum had made her faster, stronger, more attuned to danger. But had it made her reckless? The corridors of the station stretched before them, twisting and broken. The air was growing thinner, the filtration system failing even more under the weight of time. Dorian could hear the distant hum of another docking sequence, more smugglers breaching the outer hull. Xyra glanced back at him. "If we fight, we win." Dorian tightened his grip on his weapon. "You sound sure of that." Xyra's lips curled slightly. "I am." Dorian hesitated. Not because he doubted her abilities, but because something about the way she said it sent a chill through him. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't confidence, it was certainty. The kind that came from something beyond just skill. The kind that came from something changed. Dorian didn't have time to unpack that thought. Footsteps echoed ahead. Xyra moved first. The fight wasn't fair, not for the smugglers. Xyra struck before they had a chance to react. She was fast, too fast. Her movements blurred, weaving through the dim light like a specter. Dorian barely tracked her as she took down the first man with a brutal efficiency, sending his weapon clattering to the ground before he could even fire. The second raised his rifle. Dorian fired first. The smuggler crumpled and Dorian didn't hesitate to move forward, adrenaline pounding in his veins. But Xyra was already ahead, her body a fluid motion of controlled destruction. Dorian saw the moment it happened, the moment when Xyra didn't stop. The last smuggler had already hit the ground, groaning, weapon out of reach. He was done, no longer a threat. But Xyra didn't slow. Her eyes burned violet, her muscles coiled, ready to strike again. Dorian moved before he thought. Xyra, his voice cut through the chaos. She froze. For a split second, she didn't move. Then her breathing hitched. Dorian watched as something flickered in her expression, confusion, conflict. Then she stepped back. The smuggler scrambled away, fear in his eyes, not daring to look back. Xyra exhaled, her hands clenched at her sides. Dorian didn't lower his weapon, not yet. She turned to him. Her voice was steady. I stopped. Dorian swallowed hard. Did you almost not? Silence. Xyra's jaw tightened. I don't know. And that terrified him. Dorian didn't lower his weapon, not yet. His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than the distant hum of the failing station. Xyra stood just a few feet away, shoulders tense, fingers twitching. The glow along her skin had faded, but the memory of that moment still lingered. She hadn't stopped because she wanted to. She had stopped because he called her name. Xyra exhaled slowly, controlled, measured. You think I lost control? Dorian's grip tightened. Didn't you? Her gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through her expression before she looked away. The silence stretched. Dorian took a careful step forward, watching her body language for any sign that she wasn't entirely herself. But she didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring at the floor like it held an answer she couldn't find. This is what I meant, he said quietly. You don't know how far this goes. And you don't know if you can stop it. Xyra's jaw clenched. I stopped. Because I called you, Dorian countered. What happens when I'm not there? She inhaled sharply but didn't respond. That was what scared him the most. Dorian ran a hand through his hair, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to fix this. He needed to help her before it got worse. He knew the serum. He knew how enhancements could spiral out of control, and he wasn't about to let it happen to her. Xyra turned to him, her voice quiet. Do you think I'm dangerous? Dorian didn't answer immediately. He wasn't stupid enough to lie. I think you could be. Something in her expression flickered, something almost like hurt but buried beneath layers of unreadable calculation. She nodded once, as if filing that information away. Then she straightened, regaining the sharp-edged composure that had cracked for only a moment. We need to go, she said, voice even again. Dorian hesitated, but she was already moving, and that unsettled him more than anything else. They reached the docking bay in silence. Dorian's ship sat waiting, powered up from the remote sequence he had triggered earlier. The station was falling apart around them, alarms blaring faintly from corridors they had long since abandoned. Xyra climbed the ramp first, but as Dorian followed, he felt the shift in atmosphere before he even heard them. They weren't alone. A low hum filled the air, a vibration through the metal under his feet. Dorian spun, rifle raised just as three figures stepped into view at the edge of the bay. Smugglers, not just stragglers this time. Their leader stood at the front, taller than the rest, his heavy coat sweeping around him as he leveled a pistol at them. A scar ran down the side of his face, cutting through what might have once been a tattoo. Funny thing about fugitives, the man drawled. They always think they're smarter than the ones chasing them. Dorian barely resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He really didn't have time for this. Xyra stood beside him, her body relaxed in a way that set every nerve in his body on edge. The leader smirked. "I don't care about you, scavenger." His gaze flicked to Xyra. "I care about her." Dorian didn't lower his weapon. "Not happening." The smuggler ignored him, stepping forward. "You feel it, don't you?" he said, directing the words at Xyra. "The strength, the clarity, the power." Dorian tensed. Xyra didn't move. The smuggler tilted his head like he was studying her. "You don't need him." Dorian exhaled sharply. "Oh, for—" Xyra spoke before he could finish. "You don't understand," she murmured. The smuggler smirked. "I understand plenty." Xyra's eyes flicked up, locking onto him, and for a moment there was something dark there, something cold and unreadable. Then she took a step forward. Dorian stiffened. "Xyra." She ignored him. The smuggler grinned. "That's it. You know where you belong." Xyra stopped barely a foot from him. Then she tilted her head slightly, considering him. And then, in the blink of an eye, she moved, faster than Dorian had ever seen. 1 second, the smuggler was standing tall, confident. The next, he was on his knees, gasping, Xyra's hand wrapped around his throat. The other 2 smugglers barely had time to react before she struck again, her movements like liquid violence, precise and unstoppable. One crumpled with a strangled gasp. The other tried to run. Tried. Dorian saw it happen in slow motion. Saw the way Xyra didn't hesitate, didn't stop, didn't think. Xyra, her body locked. The last smuggler lay at her feet, barely conscious. Xyra stood over him, her breathing sharp, her fingers still curled into a half-formed strike. But she had stopped. Barely. Dorian stepped forward slowly, carefully. "It's over." Xyra's shoulders rose and fell, the glow along her skin flickering like static. Then finally she exhaled, stepping back. The smuggler hit the ground, gasping for air. Dorian swallowed hard, gripping his rifle. "We need to leave. Now." Xyra didn't argue. She turned toward the ship, stepping up the ramp without another word. Dorian followed, sealing the hatch behind them. The engines roared to life. As they broke free of the station, as the debris-strewn void swallowed the ruins behind them, Dorian risked a glance toward Xyra. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring ahead, jaw clenched. "You okay?" he asked. Her fingers tightened against her knee. Then finally she whispered, "I don't know." Dorian exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Neither did he. The silence in the cockpit stretched between them like a taut wire, fragile and ready to snap. The station was behind them now, swallowed by the black, its signal lost in the vastness of space. The smugglers wouldn't be getting up anytime soon, but Dorian knew better than to assume they were safe. Xyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, unmoving. Her fingers were curled against the armrests, her breathing measured, but he could see it, the faint tremor running through her shoulders. She wasn't fine. Dorian adjusted the ship's course, setting them on a random trajectory for now. He needed time to think, needed time to figure out what the hell they were supposed to do next, but first he turned to her. "Tell me what happened back there." Xyra didn't look at him. Dorian's grip tightened on the controls. "You almost killed them." "I didn't," she murmured. "Not because you stopped yourself," he countered. "Because I stopped you." Her jaw clenched. Dorian exhaled sharply. "That's not nothing, Xyra." "I know." Silence. Dorian studied her, watching the way she held herself rigid, like she was trying to contain something barely restrained. He softened his tone. "How did it feel?" Her eyes flickered toward him just for a second. Then, barely above a whisper, "Easy." The word sent a cold shiver down Dorian's spine, not because of what it meant, but because of the way she said it, not in fear, not in hesitation, just truth. Dorian leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "The serums rewriting your instincts." Xyra nodded, slow and deliberate. "I know. We need to stop it." Her fingers curled slightly. "Do we?" Dorian stilled. "Xyra." She exhaled, tilting her head back against the seat, eyes closing briefly. "You're afraid I'm losing myself." "You should be afraid of that too," he shot back. She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze. The shifting violet of her irises glowed faintly in the dim cockpit light. "I'm not," she murmured. Dorian clenched his jaw. "Then you're lying to yourself." Xyra didn't answer right away. She just studied him, watching him like she was calculating something. Then finally, "I stopped." Dorian swallowed. "Because I was there." She held his gaze. "And you always will be." Something about the way she said it made his stomach tighten. There was no hesitation, no doubt. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a fact. Dorian exhaled slowly. "That's not a solution." Xyra smirked faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's a start." Dorian wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that wasn't how this worked. But the truth was, he didn't know how this worked. The serum had bonded with her in a way he had never seen before. This wasn't just enhanced strength or heightened perception. This was something deeper, something permanent. He needed to figure out how far it went before it was too late. Dorian turned back to the controls. "We need a real plan." Xyra leaned back, arms folding across her chest. "Do you have one?" Dorian hesitated. "Then there's a research station 3 systems out. It's off the grid, private facility." "I used to know someone there." Xyra arched an eyebrow. "You trust them?" Dorian exhaled. "I trust them more than anyone else right now." Xyra studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's go." Dorian locked in the coordinates, pushing the ship into faster-than-light travel. As the stars stretched around them, he stole one last glance at her. She looked calm, too calm, and that scared him more than anything else. The ship dropped out of hyperspace with a lurch, the quiet hum of the engine settling into a steady rhythm. Dorian's hands remained firm on the controls, his mind running through every possible scenario. The research station lay just ahead, floating against the backdrop of a blue gas giant, its structure sleek and unmarked by time. It had been years since he last set foot there. Since he last spoke to the one person who might have the answers they needed. Xyra sat beside him, posture relaxed, but Dorian knew better. She was coiled, waiting. Not out of fear. He doubted she even felt fear anymore. But because something inside her was shifting, and neither of them knew what happened when the shift reached its breaking point. Dorian tapped the comms panel. "Unidentified vessel approaching private research station Horizon 4, requesting docking clearance." Silence. Then a burst of static. A woman's voice, sharp and clipped. "Dorian Hale. I was wondering when you'd finally crawl back." Dorian exhaled. So she was still here. "Nice to hear your voice too, Vela," he muttered. "I need your help." A dry laugh came through the comms. "You always do." A pause. "Docking Bay 2 is open. You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't space you the second you step out of that ship." The line cut. Xyra smirked. "Charming." Dorian sighed. "She likes to hold grudges." Xyra leaned back. "Should I be worried?" "Not unless she tries to kill me." Xyra arched an eyebrow. "And if she does?" Dorian smirked faintly, setting the ship down on the docking clamps. "Then you'll get a free show." The landing sequence completed, and the ramp lowered with a quiet hiss. The air inside the station was cold, sterile. Dorian stepped out first, pulse rifle still slung over his shoulder, his body tensed for whatever reception awaited him. Vela was already there. She hadn't changed much, tall, dark-haired, eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. She crossed her arms, studying him with a look that made it very clear she had not forgotten the last time they saw each other. Dorian cleared his throat. "You look good." Vela tilted her head. "You look like a bad decision waiting to happen." Xyra stepped up beside him. Vela's gaze flicked to her, scanning, calculating. She wasn't one to waste words. "This her," Dorian nodded. "She drank the serum." Vela exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You really don't do things halfway, do you?" Dorian ran a hand through his hair. "Can you help or not?" Vela considered Xyra again, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then she turned on her heel. Follow me. The lab was small, cluttered, filled with tech Dorian only half recognized. Xyra wasted no time, running scans as Xyra stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, waiting. Dorian watched the readings populate across the monitors. He didn't like what he saw. Xyra frowned. This isn't just enhancement. The serum is integrating into her at a cellular level. Xyra met Dorian's gaze unbothered. I told you. Dorian ignored her, focusing on Xyra. How long does she have before it stabilizes? Xyra tapped a few keys, then leaned back. It already has. Dorian's stomach twisted. You mean she's not changing anymore? Xyra confirmed. She's changed. This is permanent. Xyra exhaled slowly. No surprise, no shock, just quiet understanding. Dorian, however, felt his world tilt. He had spent every second thinking there would be a way to fix this. A reversal. A cure. But there wasn't. Xyra wasn't becoming something else. She already was. Dorian ran a hand down his face. What does that mean for her? Xyra hesitated. And that wasn't a good sign. She's stronger, she said carefully, faster, but there's something else, something the serum awakened that wasn't supposed to be touched. Xyra finally spoke. What? Xyra tapped the monitor, flipping the display. A detailed scan of Xyra's neural structure appeared. It didn't just enhance your instincts, it sharpened them beyond control. Dorian's stomach dropped. Meaning? Xyra's gaze darkened. Meaning the next time she loses control, she glanced at Xyra. She might not come back. The air in the room went still. Xyra's expression remained unreadable, but Dorian saw the shift. The flicker of something deep inside her that even she wasn't sure she understood. Dorian stepped forward. There has to be a way to stop it. Xyra exhaled sharply. I could suppress the neural responses, keep her instincts from overriding her mind. Dorian nodded. Do it. Xyra's voice cut through the air. No. Dorian turned to her. Xyra, no. Her tone was firm, unshakable. I won't let you weaken me. Dorian's breath caught. This isn't about weakness. It is to you, she snapped. You think I need to be saved. I don't. Dorian's pulse pounded. You almost killed someone. Xyra stepped closer, her gaze burning. And I stopped. Dorian swallowed hard. Because I was there. Her fingers curled into fists. And you always will be. The words were a challenge, a promise, a truth she believed with absolute certainty. Dorian searched her face. He wanted to argue, wanted to fix this. But deep down he already knew this wasn't his choice. It was hers. Silence stretched. Xyra sighed. Well, that was dramatic. Dorian shot her a glare. Xyra shrugged. She's right, though. If she doesn't want it, I won't force it. Dorian exhaled. His hands flexed at his sides, frustration curling deep inside him. Then Xyra's fingers brushed his. A silent I know. A silent trust me. Dorian closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. Xyra smirked. You two are something. Dorian ignored her, turning to Xyra. Then what's the plan? Xyra's lips curled. We finish what we started. Dorian arched a brow. Meaning? Xyra turned toward the monitor, her voice quiet. The smugglers won't stop, so we stop them first. Dorian stared at her for a long moment, then he smirked. Now that, he said, is a plan. The final battle was coming, and this time they wouldn't be running. Dorian tightened the straps on his gear, pulse steady despite the weight of what they were about to do. The plan wasn't complicated. Hit the smugglers first before they regrouped. Take them out at the source. A preemptive strike. Xyra stood across from him, rolling her shoulders, testing her movements like a predator waiting for the cage door to open. The faint bioluminescence along her skin pulsed in slow waves, reacting to the shift in her focus. Xyra sat at the control station, typing without looking at either of them. You do realize this is insane, right? Dorian gave her a flat look. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep coming. Xyra gestured toward Xyra. I don't care about them. I care about you. If this goes sideways, she'll be fine. You are still just a man. Xyra's gaze flicked to him at that, unreadable. Dorian shrugged. I'll manage. Vela sighed, muttering under her breath. You were always bad at survival instincts, Dorian smirked. Not dead yet. Vela didn't seem comforted. I've locked their ship coordinates. They're regrouping at a station near the Calyx belt. Minimal security, mostly underground docking. She flicked a switch, and a hologram of the location appeared. You'll have a small window to get inside before they detect your approach. After that, you're on your own. Dorian studied the layout. One main entry, 2 side routes. Smugglers would post guards at both. The underground docking meant limited aerial escape options, but that also worked in their favor. If the smugglers couldn't run, they couldn't regroup. Xyra studied the schematic with sharp eyes, then turned to Dorian. You take the control center, I'll clear the ground teams. Dorian hesitated. Are you sure? Xyra gave him a slow smile. You don't think I can handle it, he exhaled. That's not what her hand brushed against his, light but intentional. I'll be fine, Dorian. He didn't doubt that. He just didn't know if he would be. Vela groaned, standing up. Great. Just promise me you won't bring the entire station down on yourselves. No promises, Dorian muttered, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Xyra was already heading toward the ship's ramp, moving with quiet precision. He followed, feeling the energy between them shift, not just tension, not just strategy, something deeper. She paused just before stepping onto the ramp. Dorian, he stopped. Her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Don't die, Dorian smirked. You too, and then they were moving. The Calyx Belt station was ugly. A skeletal husk of metal and broken industry, wedged between drifting asteroids. The smugglers had fortified it just enough to make it defensible but not enough to be official. Perfect for criminals. Dorian guided the ship into a stealth approach, using the natural debris field as cover. Xyra had already suited up, light armor, compact weapons, movement unhindered. Every inch of her radiated focus. Dorian landed them near a secondary airlock, bypassing the main docking channels. As the ramp lowered, Xyra stepped forward, eyes scanning the surroundings. Dorian moved beside her. We stay in contact, she nodded. If you need help, Dorian smirked. I'll try not to. Xyra arched a brow but didn't argue, then she was gone. Dorian exhaled sharply, adjusting his gear. Focus. The infiltration was smooth at first, too smooth. Dorian slipped past the first set of guards, using old maintenance shafts to bypass the central corridors. The station's security was sloppy, predictable. That's what worried him. They weren't just dealing with common smugglers anymore. They had resources, which meant someone was backing them. Dorian reached the control center, disabling the external comms in under 2 minutes. No outgoing transmissions, no reinforcements. But just as he finished locking the main doors, the alarms blared. Dorian's stomach dropped. They knew. His comm crackled, Xyra's voice calm but sharp. They were waiting. Dorian's jaw clenched. Trap. A brief pause. Not for me. That was the only warning he got. The next second, the door behind him exploded. Dorian hit the ground as heat and pressure ripped through the air. The impact rang through his skull, white-hot pain flashing across his vision. Boots, weapons clicking into place, voices. Got him. Dorian tried to push himself up, but a heavy boot slammed against his back, shoving him down. A voice he recognized, the smuggler leader from before. Well, the man drawled. Look what we caught. Dorian gritted his teeth. Not much of a catch, the smuggler chuckled. No, but your bait. Dorian froze. His blood turned ice cold. They hadn't been waiting for him. They had been waiting for her. The smuggler leader grinned, tapping his comm. We have the scientist. Bring in the girl. Dorian's heart hammered. He knew Xyra. He knew what she would do, and that terrified him. Because this time she wouldn't stop, and neither would he. The world was fire and motion. Dorian barely had time to react before the smuggler leader's words turned into action. The guards hauled him up, his arms yanked behind his back, but his mind was already racing. They wanted Xyra. not dead, captured, which meant they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Which meant they were already dead. The calm on the smuggler's wrist crackled. "Sir, the voice cut off. Dorian didn't have to see what happened next to know. The lights flickered. A deep silence settled over the station, then a single thud, a strangled breath, a crack like bone breaking. Dorian's captors stiffened. The smuggler leader narrowed his eyes. "What the?" The corridor outside the control room darkened. Then Xyra stepped through the doorway. She wasn't running, she wasn't even rushing. She stalked. Her skin pulsed with faint light, her irises nothing but a deep, burning violet. She wasn't hiding the change anymore. She was owning it. The first smuggler raised his weapon. He never got the chance to fire. Xyra moved faster than Dorian could track. 1 second she was standing still. The next, she had closed the distance between them. The man gasped, choking on nothing, his body lifted off the ground by a single, unyielding grip around his throat. The leader took a slow step back. "Hold on." Xyra's head tilted. Her lips parted slightly. She smiled. Then she threw the smuggler into the wall. The impact sent a sharp vibration through the floor. The man crumpled, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Dorian twisted against his captor's grip, using the distraction to break free. He drove his elbow backward, catching the guard off balance, then spun, slamming the heel of his palm into the man's throat. He collapsed in a heap. The last smuggler turned to run. Xyra was already there. She caught him mid-step, pinning him against the wall with a single movement, her strength terrifying in its ease. The smuggler gasped, his eyes wide. Xyra didn't even look at him. She turned to Dorian instead, waiting. Dorian met her gaze, and in that moment he realized this was her choice. Not the serums, not the instincts that had sharpened and burned through her mind. Hers. Dorian swallowed, then quietly let him go. Xyra's fingers loosened. The smuggler collapsed to the floor, scrambling backward, his breath shaking. Xyra didn't even acknowledge him as she turned to Dorian, her expression unreadable. The smuggler leader was still standing in the center of the room, hands up, calculating. "Listen." Xyra didn't let him finish. She moved forward slowly, deliberately. Her eyes flicked up and down his frame, assessing. "You made a mistake," she murmured. The smuggler's lips parted. Xyra leaned in just slightly, voice quiet. "You thought I was something to be caught." The man visibly shuddered. Dorian cleared his throat. "We're done here." Xyra didn't look away from the smuggler leader. For a moment Dorian thought she might ignore him, might take this one step further. Then she exhaled and turned away. Dorian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We're leaving," he muttered. No one stopped them. The ship was quiet. Xyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring out into the black. Dorian powered up the thrusters, his muscles aching from the fight, his mind spinning. He should say something, should ask her how she felt, should try to talk about what happened back there. Instead, he asked, "Are you hungry?" Xyra blinked, then huffed a quiet laugh. "That's your question," Dorian shrugged. "Just checking." She studied him. Then softly, "No." Silence stretched. Dorian swallowed hard. "Back there, when you stopped. I chose to." Dorian nodded slowly. Xyra tilted her head, watching him. "You thought I wouldn't." He hesitated. Then, honestly, "I wasn't sure." She exhaled, her gaze dropping briefly. "Neither was I." That hit harder than he expected. Dorian ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the tension wound tight in his chest. But the weight of the past few days clung to him. The way Xyra had moved. The way she had looked at him like she wasn't entirely sure if she was still herself. And the way he had felt watching her, terrified that one day he might not be able to call her back. He leaned back against the console, staring at the ceiling. "This has been the longest week of my life." Xyra smirked slightly. "You survived." Dorian glanced at her. "So did you." Something in her expression flickered. Then, before he could process it, she stood and walked toward him. Not fast. Not hesitant, just certain. Dorian barely had time to react before she reached him, hands pressing against his chest, her body fitting against his like a second skin. His breath caught. "Xyra," she kissed him. It wasn't like before. It wasn't slow or testing. It was demanding. Like she had decided something. Like she wasn't waiting anymore. Dorian melted. His hands found her waist, gripping tight as heat crashed through him. Xyra's fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss until there was nothing left between them. No space, no hesitation, no second guessing. Just them. Dorian broke away only when his lungs demanded air, his forehead resting against hers. His pulse was pounding. His mind a mess of static. Xyra's fingers didn't let go. Her voice was soft but so sure. "I don't want to stop." Dorian swallowed hard. His hands skimmed down her back, his heart thundering. "We don't have to." She kissed him again. And this time he didn't hold back. The universe could wait. Right now, this was all that mattered. The ship drifted through the quiet void, stars stretching endlessly around them. The tension of battle had faded, replaced by something softer, something heavier. Dorian lay awake in the dim glow of the cockpit monitors, listening to the quiet hum of the ship's systems, the steady rhythm of Xyra's breathing beside him. She was different now. But then again, maybe she always had been, and he was just now realizing it. Xyra stirred slightly, shifting beneath the light blanket draped over them. Her skin still held that faint bioluminescent glow, but it wasn't wild or unstable anymore. It pulsed with an easy, quiet rhythm, like her body had finally found balance between what she was and what she had become. Dorian exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "So," Xyra smirked without opening her eyes. "So," Dorian let out a quiet chuckle. "You're staying then?" Xyra finally cracked one eye open, studying him. "Would you stop me if I wasn't?" Dorian searched her face, the hint of amusement in her gaze, the steady confidence she carried now, not reckless, not desperate, just herself. He shook his head. "No," Xyra nodded as if she already knew his answer. Then she propped herself up slightly, tracing idle patterns along his forearm. "I could have left a long time ago." Dorian arched an eyebrow. "You saying I slowed you down?" Her lips curled. "I'm saying I didn't want to leave." Dorian's throat tightened. He knew what she meant, even if she wasn't saying it outright. For the first time in too many years, he wasn't alone. And neither was she. Xyra exhaled, resting her head against his shoulder. "You still worried about me?" Dorian sighed. "I'll probably always worry about you." She smiled against his skin. "Good." They stayed like that for a moment, just breathing. Then Xyra shifted, stretching like a feline before swinging her legs over the edge of the bed and standing. "So, what now, scientist?" Dorian watched her for a long moment before rolling onto his back, staring up at the ceiling. What now? The smugglers were done. There was no one left chasing them. No more battles to fight, no more desperate plans to survive. But there was still something else, something bigger. Dorian sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. "The serum worked." Xyra arched an eyebrow. "You mean it turned me into something new?" Dorian met her gaze. "It turned you into something stronger." Xyra crossed her arms, tilting her head. "So what, you want to start making more of it?" Dorian exhaled. "No, because that was the problem, wasn't it? The serum hadn't just been an accident, it had been a success. A dangerous, unpredictable, world-altering success, and he couldn't trust anyone with it. Xyra watched him carefully, something sharp and knowing in her gaze. "You want to destroy it?" Dorian hesitated, then nodded. Xyra studied him for a moment, then walked toward the console, tapping a few keys. "If we wipe your research, it's gone for good. No backups, no way to recreate it." Dorian nodded again. "I know." He had spent his life chasing scientific breakthroughs, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But now, for the first time, he understood the cost. Some things weren't meant to be controlled. Xyra's fingers hovered over the console. "You're sure?" Dorian looked at her, really looked at her. He had started this journey believing he had to fix what had gone wrong, that he had to reverse the changes, erase what had happened. But Xyra wasn't broken. She had evolved, and she had chosen to stay. Dorian reached out, covering her hand with his. "Yeah, I'm sure." Xyra nodded once, then pressed the final command. The files vanished. The data, everything, erased. It was over. Dorian let out a slow breath, a weight lifting from his chest. Xyra smirked. "Look at you, doing the right thing," Dorian chuckled. "Don't get used to it." Xyra turned toward him, studying him with a quiet intensity. Then she reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his jaw. "So what are we doing next?" Dorian's pulse jumped, but he forced himself to stay casual. "Haven't thought that far ahead." Xyra arched a brow. "Liar." Dorian sighed, shaking his head. "You want the truth," Xyra smirked. "For once, yeah," Dorian exhaled. "I don't care where we go. As long as it's with you." Xyra stilled. For a moment she didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned in, pressing her lips against his in a kiss that was softer than the last, but no less intense. Dorian melted into it, his fingers curling against her waist, holding her close. When she finally pulled back, her violet eyes glowed in the dim light. "You really mean that?" she murmured. Dorian met her gaze. "Yeah, I do." Xyra grinned. "Then let's go find trouble." Dorian laughed. "I have a feeling we won't have to look far." She grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the cockpit. "Then let's not waste time." Dorian followed without hesitation. No more running, no more looking back. Just the unknown stretching out before them, full of possibilities. And for once, he wasn't afraid of any of it.